So let me start you with a question here, because it's what we're going to see today. Can you remember a time when you were hurt by someone really badly? Like they really, really wounded you because of what they did, what they said, how they acted, things like that. Then, let me just kind of step us through different scenarios here. Then do you remember when it was somebody that should have known better? Like they were close to you, or they just, should have been mature enough. Or what I know can happen a lot of times is what happens if that person is in your faith community, right? And they do something that hurts you and wounds you and leaves you feeling like you've been gutted. What then, right? There's all kinds of wounded sheep running around out there because they've been really hurt by people inside their faith community, right? Or, like what we're going to see today, because we're also going to see a little bit of that today in Genesis 21, but we're also going to see what happens when life just throws something at you that makes you absolutely miserable and turns your world upside down. What do you do then? Because we're going to see both physically and figuratively today, people are going to be driven out into the wilderness. So when I was looking over the material, the scripture for this morning, I was asking myself, when was the last time that I felt like God brought me out into the wilderness? Like that spiritually desolate place, the place where maybe I feel like I can't see Him, I can't feel Him, I can't hear Him. Like when was the last time that you went there, and what did you do when you were there? Because there's great lessons to be learned today in what we see in these people as they're forced out into that space. And again, it's like, did you see God there when you went there? Did the people today see God when they went there? And if we recognize God in those wilderness places, what could He do in our hearts? What kind of healing could He provide? What kind of answers, wisdom, insight could He provide? Courage could He provide? Conviction if we need it? Because sometimes it might be like, you're out here in the wilderness because you did something wrong. And you got to be humble enough to seek God and understand that and listen to His voice out there. So there's a lot of these kind of themes today, but what might happen? And that brings us, because we're in part 4 of Genesis, wrestling with reality, but that question brings us to our part 4 questions. Do I trust God with the unknown? Because today you're going to see the promise fulfilled that we've been waiting on now from Genesis 12 on, all the way up to here we are in 21. So we're going to see the promise fulfilled, but there's also that bigger chunk of chapter 21 of the unknown, of being driven out into that wilderness. And what happens when we go there? So today, finding God in the wilderness in Genesis 21. As the connection point from last week, we saw that Abraham once again deceived a king. Once again, he gave a half-truth to protect himself, and once again, he put his wife Sarah in a pretty difficult, dangerous situation, and once again, God had to deliver Sarah from pretty difficult circumstances. So here we are, again, here's the promise made, and here's the people that are part of the promise, Abraham specifically, that seem to be working against it pretty hard, because his wife is supposed to be the mother of the promised child, and yet he keeps putting her in these pretty precarious situations. So we see the goodness of God just showing up again and again and again with sometimes very messy situations. But today, finding God in the wilderness in Genesis 21. So, first verse. The Lord came to Sarah as He said. So He's good to His word. And the Lord, Yahweh, did for Sarah what He had promised. So what did He promise? Well, Genesis 12, 15, 17, 18. He's been saying it again and again and again. Finally, He shows up at the time that He said He would in Genesis 18, and He's going to make this promise come true. They had to come through a lot. It's been 25 years they've been waiting on this promise since Genesis 12. 25 years has passed. So a lot has happened in them. And you're going to see that theme of God slowly doing things in people to prepare them for something, right? That's part of the wilderness, I think. But they're going to respond to this verse right here, to this idea, this event. They're going to respond in 3 ways. One, they're going to follow through on naming him Isaac. They're going to circumcise the boy. And then I think one of the most important ones is they're actually going to thank God for the gift that they've been given. They don't forget God in the midst of the blessing, which is a good lesson for us, right? When God does answer prayers, when He does follow through, when He does show up, let's make sure to take a hot second and just say, Lord, thank you for being here. Thank you for answering that. Thank you for providing whatever it is. So those 3 things are how they respond. But then later in this chapter, something really strange happens. And we'll look at that in a minute when we get there. But verse 2. So this is what He does. He shows up. He does what He says He's going to do. And this is it. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, right? So we're talking about the miraculous. At the appointed time, again, he's good to his word, and Abraham named his son who was born to him, the one Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Now what I love about that little section there, the one Sarah bore to him, that is an uncommon Hebrew construction. And the reason it's thrown in here, and it doesn't read as it normally would with the birth of a child, is because they're highlighting, and I think in a small way, the author is really bringing dignity to Sarah as the mother of the promised child. It's just not how you would normally write something like this. So it's cool and significant that she's singled out. Like, just so you remember, this is Sarah that had this child, right? She was the one of the promise. God was faithful to her. Now, this name Isaac, that name means he laughs. Isaac doesn't sound in Hebrew like it does in English. It's Yitzhak is how it sounds in Hebrew. And the reason I go into this just a little bit is not to just make, us aware of Hebrew, but this idea of laughing there's a lot of wordplay on this in chapter 21, on this idea of laughing. And it takes a turn into really borderline deadly circumstances based on this word laughs. And so it does have a theme in this chapter. But that's what that means, because it's a reminder of when she laughed. So God's showing up, doing this thing that he said he was going to do from 12 to 21, chapters 12 to 21. All we get in a super anticlimactic way is 3 verses. He's been talking about this now for 25 years-ish. And it's like, and then he was born. And that's what we get. So I wondered, why such a short, why not, make it a little more flowery? And I think the author is just saying, look, God did it. God was faithful to his word, and he was faithful to the details of his plan, period. I don't need to make it any more flowery. God did what he said he was going to do when he said he was going to do it. So that's pretty cool. Now, what did they do? What comes after this? What are the steps after? So verse 4, when his son Isaac was 8 days old, and that's a significant date, Abraham circumcised him as God had commanded him. Now, what's cool medically about this today, and I had to look some of these words up because I'm obviously not a medical person, right? So at 8 days, modern science understands that when you baptize a child or a boy at that day, that's when there's 2 things that have happened in that boy's body. So vitamin K is at the highest it's going to be to that point. And then each service I've had to look at this to make sure I'm saying this right. Prothrombin, so for all my medical types out there, is also at its highest at that point at 8 days. So medically speaking, that's the best time to circumcise a boy so that he doesn't have problems with blood clotting. That's what those 2 things do. So it's just cool. 4,000 years ago, God was like, you don't even understand this. I'm just going to tell you the date and just trust me. You're going to have a lot less problems if you wait till day 8, right? So it's just cool how we've, modern medicine, we understand that now. But God was telling him, this is when you want to do this. So, verse 5. Abraham, here's the miracle of it. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. So it's yep, there's the miracle, there's the craziness of it. But it took 25 years of wandering in the wilderness to get to this point. So this morning, because this is such a pivotal chapter, because the promise is finally here, I just want to do several flashbacks. Because one of my jobs as a pastor, I want you to see how all these things fit together, rather than just kind of reading and moving on. But how do they fit together? What has been said? So, we're in chapter 21. Way back when the journey started, in chapter 12, we see this. So Abraham went, so he leaves his homeland, as the Lord had told him, and Lot, and then I added in Sarai, because she's also with him, went with him. So that's who he's taken up. Abram at the time, he hadn't had his name changed yet. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran to head for the land of Canaan. So he's 75, and now he's 100. So a lot of time has passed, 25 years, a quarter of a century has passed for them to get where they are. Now, how do they respond to this? Sarah said, God has made me laugh, and everyone who hears will laugh with me. So there's a play on Isaac's name. She remembers the name, the purpose of the name, and she says, my laugh of doubt has turned to laugh of joy. So she understands the significance of what's happening to her right now. Verse 7. She also said, who would have told Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne a son for him in his old age. It's this is crazy, right? They understand that. But it's a big deal in the New Testament. So Abraham and his family come up constantly in the New Testament. So it's good to understand as you're reading through your New Testament to say, okay, this family was pivotal and they started everything. And so much keeps getting talked about in your New Testament about this family. And so 2,000 years after Abraham and Sarah are doing, this is all happening to them in Genesis 21, the writer of Hebrews in the New Testament, again, 2,000 years after Abraham, is looking back and he's understanding the lessons of faith in the Jewish community. And so Hebrews chapter 11 is like the Hall of Faith chapter, and all of these big Jewish names are getting put forward as like, look what God did through them. Look at the faith they had. And then finally, he's going to get around to the point of talking about Abraham and Sarah. So by faith, again, referring to this event we're reading about today, by faith, even Sarah herself, when she was unable to have children, received power to conceive offspring. So God himself had to step in and do this. So even though she was past the age, since she considered that the one who made the promise was faithful, she trusted in God, even though what was before her was impossible. That's just a good lesson, like about faith. Okay, what's in front of me is impossible, but I'm just going to trust you, God, to get me through this. Right? That's what we see happening. And one of the most common ways I talk about this with people is relationships and jobs. I feel like it's always coming up, some kind of relational thing. I don't know how to get through this, Lord, but I have to trust you. My job might be going out to another country or another state, but I got to trust you with this, God. My boss is a jerk and clearly wants me out of here. And it's like there's a lot of like work things where we have to trust God, even though it seems what's in front of us is impossible. And then verse 12, therefore, and I love how the Bible writers are just so blunt sometimes. Therefore, from one man, in fact, from one as good as dead, came offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky. So this dude was old, right? This is a crusty old man, is what he's saying, if we want to translate that. And yet, came offspring as numerous as stars of the sky, and as innumerable as the grains of sand along the seashore. This is 2,000 years later, looking back at this very important event in the history of Israel and in the history of the world. Because if you become a Christian, you get adopted into the family of Abraham. So that's why it's talked about so much in the New Testament. Right? But now that it's happened, the child has come, is it like happily ever after? What happens next? The promise is finally here. And then it's just boom, you get 7 verses and that's it. What happens next is very difficult. What happens next can, if you're not paying attention, make you really question the goodness of God, the fairness of God, the justice of God. And so that's why you want to slow down and think about, okay, what exactly is happening to these people in this next scene? Because it takes a shift for sure, because Hagar and Ishmael are going to be sent away. Now, this seems hard, but it's something that had to happen. God said, your son Isaac is going to be the promised son, because through him is going to come, they don't know this then, but that's going to come Jesus. 2,000 years later, Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world, is going to come through this child, Isaac. So no, I have not chosen Ishmael. So there has to be a separation of these two families at this point, because they made the mistake. If you're not aware of why this kid is even here, because they rushed it. God said, I'm going to give you a child. And they said, okay, well, we'll just make it happen ourselves. Right? So now God is going to have to step in the middle of this messiness and still carry out his plan, but still care for Hagar and Ishmael. So this is where it gets really thorny. So, verse 8, this is what it says. Isaac grew and was weaned. So that means that he's being weaned from his mother's milk and to actually eat solid foods now, right? So this is a big deal. It happens around 2 or 3 years old. And Abraham held a great feast on the day Isaac was weaned. Because this is a cultural thing. So I had to do some learning myself this week, because I was like, why would they throw a big feast? It just seems like make the kid eat solid food. It's like you don't need a party, right? And so, but this is a huge cultural deal. And even in some parts of the world today, this is still a big deal. And they still actually do what we're about to see kind of happening here. And so something strange happens. It's like, yay, a big feast. But verse 9, but Sarah saw the son, and that's Ishmael, who is about 16 years old now, mocking. And that's a pretty strong word, but it's also a play on Isaac's name. So here's Ishmael, this older teenage boy, mocking the boy Isaac, the toddler Isaac. And it says the one Hagar the Egyptian had born to Abraham. So that son, that Ishmael. So then, of course, I got to asking the question, well, what was he doing? Because when I prep a sermon, I put all the scripture out in front of me, and I go through it line by line, and I try to notice, are there any important connecting words, like however, therefore? Are there any important verbs I need to keep an eye on? Are there other ideas that I know are important for that passage, words that need to be dug into a little bit more? Is there any connecting idea, other references, all this kind of stuff? But I also, as I go through, I ask questions, well, what does that mean? Why did he say that? Why did she end up there? I do all that kind of stuff so that as I go back through it, then I begin to research those questions that I have. And this was one of them. Why in the world was Ishmael mocking Isaac? this 2 to 3 year old boy. So there's a historical clue that I didn't know about until this week. So I began to research, and I asked Tim, I found this thing out, and I said, Tim, do you know what pre-mastication is? Thinking I'm going to school him up. And he's immediately like, yes, and tells me what it is. And I'm like, you little jerk, how do you know that? How do you know that? I thought I was going to be able to flex my intellectual muscle right now. And then I'm like, fine, Brittany. And I call her in, and I'm like, hey, do you know what pre-mastication is? She's like, yeah, and tells me what it is. And I'm like, how do you people know what this means? And I'm like, my ego was just wrecked this week. And so I'll tell you, for all of you in here that don't know what that is either, pre-mastication is it's something that, again, mothers still do in some sectors of the world today. When a child is weaned, pre-mastication is pre-chewing the food for your child. Right? Yeah, Ashley did the same thing first service. She was like, oh my gosh, and she looked at her mom. So here's what moms would do. Moms would chew up the food for the toddler, and then they would put it into the toddler's mouth, which is gross enough, but then the added fun if they would use their tongue to put the food in said baby's mouth. And when I came across that, I was like, there's no way that's a real thing. No way on heaven and earth that's a real thing. But it is. I started finding it in other places and other sources, and I was like, wow, so this is a real thing. So now let's take that and say, okay, so why was Ishmael mocking this baby? So if you were shoving food in a baby's mouth that had never had solid food in there before, what do you think that baby's probably going to do? It's going to spit it back out. It's going to choke. It's going to be quite a scene. But what does the mom do? The mom puts it back in her mouth and puts it back into the child's mouth, again, with her tongue. So if I'm a 16-year-old boy and I'm watching this happen, 100%, 10 out of 10 times, I'm roasting that little kid. And I am making fun of him. I'm like, oh, that's disgusting. Hey, you're like, I'm doing that. I am like not going to be mature enough when I'm a 16-year-old boy not to just give it to that little kid. Because also think context. The mothers hated each other. Sarah and Hagar did not like one another. By extension, here's this now 16-year-old boy who knows that this other wife does not accept him, does not want him. There's so much animosity now for 16 or so years. It's been boiling up. So he's probably taken advantage of this scene, but unfortunately, it goes really sideways really, really quickly. Now, what happens next had me wondering, like, again, why would Sarah react so harshly? It seems like way over the top to what's happening right now. So he totally incurs the wrath by mocking this child. So again, could this have been this, a part of this feast, which is still done in some parts of the world? Could that have been it? Probably. Because if you do another flashback to this animosity, Genesis 16:4, several chapters ago, when Hagar got pregnant, she despised her mistress, and that's Sarah. She despised Sarah. So it started immediately and has been building for all of these years. So verse 10, what happened? What did she do? So she says to Abraham, drive out, which is a really strong phrase, drive out this slave with her son. For the son of this slave, and notice there's no names, it's just this slave and her son, will not be a co-heir with my son named Isaac. Now, flashback time. This is a million miles away from where these two people used to be with this little plan that they had concocted. So let's just take a brief look back at their plan, because here it's all coming off the rails. But back in Genesis 16, this was the plan proposed by Sarah. She says, since the Lord has prevented me from bearing children, go to my slave, and this is a completely socially acceptable thing to do back then. But again, just because our culture says it's okay does not mean it's okay. So this plan is not out of the ordinary. Go to my slave, perhaps through her I can build a family. Because Abraham, if you have a child through her, legally that's my child. So that's the position they put her in. And then what did Abraham do? He was so righteous he said no, right? No, he agreed to what Sarai had said. So both of them rush in, make a bad decision. They think this is going to be the answer. One chapter later, this is now Abraham struggling with how old he is. I can't have a child. What are you talking about, God? So this is what he says to God. So they take the child, the Egyptian slave, they take Hagar, the Egyptian slave, give her to her husband Abram as a wife for him. A chapter later in Genesis 17, now he's worried. Now he's struggling because he can't have another child, he doesn't think. He says, can a child be born to a 100-year-old man, God? Can Sarah, a 90-year-old woman, give birth? So this is his solution. if only Ishmael were acceptable to you. They both want and think this boy Ishmael is going to be their answer. And now here they are getting ready to drive them out into the wilderness, essentially to potentially, possibly die because of a mistake that they made. So God works in very messy spaces, but thankfully God doesn't just throw people out because they are seen as a mistake. They are seen as inconvenient or they are a threat, because he was a threat in a very real way, this boy Ishmael. But they're a long way from that original thinking. But they did have to go. That's the difficult part, because Isaac's the chosen child, and this is where it's like, what about God's justice and his goodness? It's like, did he really have to kick him out? I mean, is that really necessary? Did they have to go down this path? Because how did Abraham feel? He's got a 16-year-old son. Imagine that. You got a 16-year-old son, and his mom, your wife also, and now you're just going to throw them out? And this is how Abraham felt. Verse 11. This was very distressing to Abraham because of his son. He really struggled with this. But he's got a plan. Like, God's got a plan, and God's now going to have to show up in this messiness. Because it's a different plan for these two boys, but it's still a plan nonetheless, because Ishmael is part of the promise. And I know I talked to a lot of people who feel thrown out and cast aside, and I just love that there's so many people that have been thrown out and cast aside in the Bible. And God just shows up, and the care he has for them is unbelievable. I love it. So this is what happens next. God shows up, says to Abraham, do not be distressed about the boy and about your slave. And I think God's kind of poking him a little bit there. He's like, yeah, you remember your slave, what you did to this woman? It's like he doesn't address her by name. It's like he's addressing her by something that his wife, so there's just this tension and this contrast that I think that God is like stepping into this messy little space with Abraham. But he says, whatever Sarah says to you, listen to her, because your offspring will be traced through Isaac. And I remember the first time I read that, not this week, but before, it's like, he's just telling him to go ahead and do it, just throw her out into the wilderness. That seems kind of harsh, God. But then he says, I will also make, well, here's the reason, I will also make a nation of the slave son because he is your offspring. I promise to be good to your offspring, and I promise to protect those that are a part of your clan, Abraham, and I'm going to stay true to my promise, even though you screwed all this up. Even though all this tension has now happened because of a choice you made, I'm still going to do what I said I was going to do. I love that. So, these two boys and their two families are going to be off in two different directions, because God has a plan for them, both. I love that. But now Abraham's got to follow through. Early in the morning, Abraham got up. He took bread. I mean, this is meager. He takes bread and a water skin. He put them on Hagar's shoulder, and he sent her and the boy away. She left and wandered in the wilderness of BeerSheba. Now, this is just like a quick note you can read right by. But again, how do I help you make connections to not just other biblical stories, but the entire Bible itself? So I found a video that highlights what BeerSheba is, where it is, and why it's important. Because the end of chapter 21, which we're not going to read, gives you the backstory of how BeerSheba got its name and what's there. But BeerSheba keeps showing up again and again and again in the Bible. It's a major place of sometimes centers of power, sometimes centers of conflict. It plays a huge role in Abraham's lineage. And so I just found a short video that gives you a sense of the scope of the place, what it looks like physically, but then also its biblical and historical importance. So check it out. This is a little video about BeerSheba.
BeerSheba is located on the northern edge of the Negev deserts, 120 kilometers or about 75 miles southwest of Jerusalem. The wilderness surrounding BeerSheba has been populated for thousands of years because of its water supply, which flows from the Hebron Hills in the winter and is stored underground in vast quantities. Water is what made this an important place in the Bible. BeerSheba, or BeerSheva, means well of oath, or well of seven, and gets its name in Genesis chapter 21, where the Philistine king Abimelech and the patriarch Abraham swore an oath regarding the well that had been contested there. The ruins of the ancient city date to early Israelite times, or about 1,000 years before Jesus. It appears to be the first planned settlement on the edge of the desert, with its grid-like layout and elaborate water system. The subterranean cistern carved out of the rock beneath the city can be seen today. Abraham spent considerable time living in BeerSheba. He planted a tamarisk tree here and showed great hospitality to the desert dwellers, or those passing into or out of the Negev. From here, the three major world religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam find some of their origin. Abraham's son, Isaac, would father Jacob, who would be renamed Israel. These offspring would be rescued and brought out of Egyptian slavery generations later. Abraham also had a son through his wife Sarah's servant, Hagar. His name was Ishmael. Because of the animosity between the two women, Hagar and Ishmael were sent away to wander in the wilderness of BeerSheba, where an angel appeared to her, giving promises from God over her son Ishmael's life. Isaac returned to the region of his youth, opening the wells that had been filled in after his father Abraham's death, and striking a treaty with the Philistine king Abimelech. God appeared to Isaac, reaffirming the promises made to his father here in BeerSheba. An altar was erected here to commemorate the spot. Later, Isaac's sons, Jacob and Esau, grew up in this area. And at the end of Isaac's life, Jacob deceitfully received the transfer of his father's blessing rather than the firstborn son, Esau. And because of the tension between the brothers, because of this, Jacob fled from here to escape the wrath of his brother. After fleeing BeerSheba, Jacob would see a vision of a stairway to heaven. Generations later, when God led Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's offspring out of slavery and into the land he had promised them, the promised land would be defined from Dan in the north to BeerSheba in the south. The sons of the prophet Samuel were judges in BeerSheba. Saul, Israel's first king, built a fort there for his campaign against the Amalekites. The prophet Elijah took refuge in BeerSheba when Jezebel ordered him killed. The prophet Amos also mentions the city for its idolatry. During the New Testament times and later the Byzantine period, the town served as a frontline defense against the Nabateans. And the last inhabitants of these ancient ruins were the Byzantines, who abandoned the city during the Arab conquest of Palestine in the 7th century. Today, modern BeerSheba is one of Israel's 10 largest cities. And as in ancient times, it sits on the edge of the desert, experiencing both the desert and Mediterranean climates. Summers are hot and dry, while winters are cool and rainy. BeerSheba is important because of its fascinating biblical history, its interesting geography, and because God appeared here to Isaac, to Jacob, to Elijah, and to Hagar.
Lot, and I just think it's really cool how this small city that's named here just almost in passing, she left and wandered in the wilderness of BeerSheba. It's like this place becomes actually really important to the biblical story. So you can kind of see what it looked like, where it was in the world. But the next scene, though, like what did she do when she went out into the wilderness is the heartbreaking part of the story. So when the water in the skin was gone, she left the boy under one of the bushes. And I remember reading that and thinking, my goodness, I cannot imagine being in such a miserable place that I would do that to one of my children. Like this just shows the heartbreak and the misery that she's going through because she thinks that he's going to die. So this is what happens. She leaves him under the bush, and then verse 16, she went and sat at a distance at about a bow shot away, which is 100 to 200 yards away. For she said, I can't bear to watch the boy die. While she sat at a distance, she wept loudly. And I just think, man, like what lower place could a parent be to just say, I have to leave my son here to die, and then I'm going to go over here to die myself. So this is just like, this is where the story is. This is where how heartbreaking this thing has become. The decision that Abraham and Sarah made, the full ramifications now are like being felt by this poor woman. But, as always, there's always a but, I think in Genesis, I swear. God heard the boy crying. Right there in the midst of this pain and all this stuff, he shows up, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what's wrong, Hagar? Don't be afraid, for God has heard the boy crying from the place where he is. Get up. Help the boy up and grasp his hand. And in Hebrew, that literal phrase is, make strong your hand in his. For I will make him a great nation, right? God said there had to be a separation. It was done in a very ugly way, a very painful way after 16 years of animosity, and yet God is going to show up and care for this boy like he said he would. I'm going to make him into a great nation, God says. His goodness, the redemption. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well. So she went and filled the water skin and gave the boy a drink. And here's what I know about me and probably you as well. There's been times in my life where I struggled so much and I felt like I was in the wilderness and I was all alone and I could not see, because of my pain in front of me, I could not see what God was doing in front of me. Just like Hagar. Like I couldn't see that there was a friend in my life that was saying, no, like you don't listen to, like Brittany has before to me been like, no, that's the enemy speaking to you, Kyle. That's not truth. That is not truth. And then what do? Yeah, I know. It's too bad you're dumb and don't know the truth, right? It's just like my heart goes down those roads and I won't listen to her, even though God has someone right in front of me, right? A way out, an answer. And so I wonder, like sometimes God has to make us, and in his goodness, thankfully, he makes us aware of his presence. So God was with the boy and he grew, and here's how his story goes. And he settled in the wilderness and became an archer, right? He's surviving in the wilderness. And he settled in the wilderness of Paran. And his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt, right? Probably because she was an Egyptian. Now, Paran is way down there. It's kind of hard to see the words, but you see Philistia at the top there. Way down toward the bottom where it gets into the desert region, that's where he settled. This is an important part of the world because the Israelites, one day, 400 or 500 years later, they're going to have to come back up through this same spot. Joseph later is going to be sold into slavery by his brothers, by the Ishmaelites, right? So there's like, these areas keep coming up of big time importance later in the biblical narrative. So the people in these stories fade away, but their descendants don't. Their impact and influence don't fade away. But here's a question I wrestled with, personally, because I know I don't always do this well. Like when I get brought out into the wilderness, whatever that might be in my life, and I don't have answers and I feel like God's not close and I'm not close to him, what am I learning out there? Because here's the question, here's the answers we don't have to these questions. What did Hagar learn? What did Ishmael learn? It's not recorded. We don't know what God did in them, what they learned, because they just kind of fade from the story. But the question, though, is more important is, okay, well, what am I learning? What do I learn from their story? What do I learn myself when I go out into the desert? And then what happens when God sends us out there? Sometimes what happens when God drags you out into that wilderness and you don't know where he is, you don't know what's going on. Further, I began to think, okay, what happens to me? And then I thought, well, the wilderness is a big theme in the Bible. God does a lot of work in people in the Bible. We don't know what he specifically does. Oftentimes, we only see them right after the wilderness experience. So here's what we see. Moses. He kills somebody and then goes running off. He kills an Egyptian, goes running off into the desert for 40 years. He's out there in obscurity being a shepherd, doing who knows what. Well, what was he thinking out there? I was living in the lap of luxury and I got myself in trouble. Now I'm in total obscurity. What are you even doing out here, God? And then God starts to speak to him. I'm going to do something great through you. I'm going to do something through you. And for 40 years, he was out there learning how to shepherd animals. Why? Because he was going to have to shepherd a bunch of people. He was going to do one of the greatest things that the world had ever seen and will ever see. And God prepared him all that time. But what happened after that? Well, he had to go back out into the desert for another 40 years. And what was God doing in them? What was he doing in the people? What was he doing in the leaders there? Right? We see these people after their moment, right? And it's like, wow, look what God did. But we forget these people spent a lot of time in the desert, growing and learning and listening to God, if they so choose. Israel, again, they wandered in the desert. They wandered as a nation, even when they were established, right? Wandered from God, and they got in trouble for it. King David had to wander a lot of years. He ran for his life in the wilderness from King Saul, who wanted him dead because he's the next guy. He had to run from his own son, Absalom, who wanted to take the country over from his father. You read a lot of the Psalms, it's David's experience out in the wilderness. You want to know how we should grow and learn? Read some of the Psalms. Read some of the Psalms. Like, what should we be doing, Lord? What should I be thinking out here in the wilderness? Well, that's what you're wrestling with in the Psalms. The prophets, same way. These guys that did major things, living in obscurity in the wilderness. Jesus, famously, Matthew 4, he's going to spend 40 days in the wilderness fasting, being tested by God. So here's trivia for you. Why did Jesus go out into the desert for 40 days? What's the thing that was the catalyst for Jesus? It was the Holy Spirit led him out into the desert. I always thought that was very interesting, that Jesus is going to start his ministry. Everybody knows Jesus, but does everybody know, like, pre-Jesus, so like, okay, I'm stepping into my ministry, and I'm going to be tested and shaped in the desert, in the wilderness, where I'm going to be attacked. What did Jesus do? He learned out there. And then Paul. I don't know the exact number on this, but one time I put the numbers together, and it's something like, it's more than a decade of time between Paul, the Apostle Paul, and the road to Damascus, and then when he shows up. I'll have to ask you guys about this later, but I think it was like 10 years or something like this, where he's like, all this time is dropped into like Ephesians and Acts and like all these little places. And one time I did the math, and I forgot to look it up this morning, so I'm shooting from my hip, so apologies if I'm a little bit off. But he had to spend a lot of time between road to Damascus and like, ooh, the Apostle Paul. And it's like, what was he doing with him out there? Well, he was teaching him. He was growing him. He was shaping this guy who had some rough edges and probably some arrogance problems to get rid of. But he was doing things in the desert. And I wonder, will we seek God out? Us. Will we seek God out in the desert? Hagar did not. I'm not hating on Hagar, but man, she was in such a mess that she just basically gave up. What will we do when we're in our wilderness? Will we seek God, or will we just lie down and wait for death? Right? It's like there's really good lessons to pull out of these as you, again, piece everything together. So, again, let's bring it where we started, Psalm 23. Right, written by a man who knew what it meant to be a shepherd, to suffer, to have heartache, right? Even when I go through the darkest valley, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? Because you are with me. In the good times? No, in the valley of the shadow of death. In my wilderness, I know you're with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me because they guide me, because God is there with us. So as I landed this plane this week, and as I land it today with you, I began to think, okay, what's the principle out of this, God? What are you saying to me? I hope you know. I always ask myself that question first. What does Kyle learn? So here's what Kyle learned this week. It was like God said, Kyle, seek my faithfulness in the wilderness. Don't just lay down. Don't just get hopeless. When you're out there for a reason. What are you learning, Kyle? Are you actively seeking my faithfulness? I'm good enough. I'll show it to you. But man, why don't we be proactive and look for his goodness? Now, Pastor Tim, when I asked him, he is a wordsmith. And I said, Tim, how would you put, I read it really quickly through my message, and I said, how would you put that? And here's how Pastor Tim put it. Don't wonder about God's wonders while you wander in the wilderness. So if Dr. Seuss were to preach this message, that's what he would have said. So let me pray on that. Lord, help us not to wonder about your wonders as we wander in the wilderness. Lord, help us to actively seek out your faithfulness when we feel separated, when we feel distant and just spiritually thirsty and dry. Jesus Christ, would you meet us there and help us to proactively seek you? God, you said you'll always be with us, Lord. If we are your children, to be a follower of Jesus, to be a Christian means that we always have you. Thank you for that promise, Jesus. Thank you for being faithful to that. Just help us to be aware of it. And I pray that in your name, Jesus Christ. Amen. All right, that's all we got for this week. Love you guys. Have a good one.